Okay, well, welcome everybody to this Nehemiah Bible study. Today we're looking at Nehemiah chapter 7, continuing on our chapter by chapter study through the book of Nehemiah. If you have a look at the earlier episodes, you'll see we've gone through all of the prior chapters to this, and today we're continuing the story, looking at Nehemiah 7. We're going to look at verses 1 to 5 specifically, but also just unpack the overall themes that we see throughout the chapter. But let's go ahead and read the verses to begin with. It goes like this from verse 1. After the wall had been rebuilt and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers, the musicians, and the Levites were appointed. I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most people do. I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot. While the gatekeepers are still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. Also, appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some at their posts and some near their own houses. Now, the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. So my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for registration by families, and I found the genealogical record of those who had been the first to return. And this is what I found written here. He goes on to unpack the genealogy throughout the rest of the chapter. But we come to this part in the story of Nehemiah where Nehemiah, he has completed the rebuilding project of the walls. It's done. It's a real big accomplishment. You can learn more about that having a look at the prior chapter 6. And at this point, we see Nehemiah is beginning to appoint people to roles, Dr. John. Now the wall has been rebuilt, beginning to just shift into what the next focus is going to be. And so why does Nehemiah see it so important right away to not rest on the laurels, but immediately get on to the next thing?
Yes, so really the categories of people that Nehemiah appointed were basically gatekeepers, musicians, Levites, and people in charge of the city, kind of leaders. Mm-hmm. And these were people appointed quickly following the completion of the city walls, really to keep up the momentum. Things have been going, things have been moving fast. We didn't want things to stagnate, didn't want complacency or discouragement to set in. The work now, the wall's been finished, but there's a lot more to be done. And just looking at a couple of examples, the gatekeepers were essential for the safety and security of the city and its people. So it's not much point, you've got the walls, but if you're not looking after the gates and your enemy come in, that's no good. And also, it may seem strange just to talk about musicians, but music has played such an important part in the worship of God.
Right.
Throughout the ages in the church, throughout Old Testament times. A lot of the Psalms are talking about the use of musical instruments in the worship of God. And also there's reference to, in Revelation, to the use of a harp. Not everybody in heaven has a harp, but certainly there's 24 elders. Worship is very important. So the musicians and gatekeepers, just couple of examples there of people appointed very quickly.
It does show, almost the order of priority for Nehemiah. The two key things you identified there, the kind of guarding what they'd built and then getting people back to worshiping God as soon as possible. I mean, Amy, we also see a bit of Nehemiah's tactical brain coming into play here, doesn't he? With where he positions the guards in front of their own houses and stuff. I mean, what do we what do we make of just Nehemiah's tactical tactician brain?
Yeah, it's very tactical, isn't it? Positioning people outside, their property. They're already protective of that as well, so they're going to be more vigilant with that as well. Super tactical, and I love as well what Dr. John was saying, because ultimately, they're not there to look at a nice wall, are they?
Right.
That's not really going to get them very far. But ultimately, this, rebuilding the wall, having, guards and watchmen, that's good. But ultimately, if we don't have the worship behind that, then, it's a little bit void, isn't it? They're not just there to look at nice walls, but actually the walls have been rebuilt so that they could worship God with a greater freedom and a greater depth. as well. You know, every victory in our life should take us into a deeper place of worship and praise.
I think that's brilliant, and we can't underestimate how valuable and how special this would have been for Israel as they begin to get back to worshiping their God. Because let's remember, this was a people returning from exile, where they've not been able to worship their God for all of this time, and it's almost like, you know, Nehemiah's remembering what's the most important thing. The wall, as you say, is that the wall is not there for the wall's sake, but it's there to give the people of God their security so that they can get back to living life as God has called them to. Laulu, I want you to comment here on what comes up next, because Nehemiah, he identifies a man called Hananiah as a man who had integrity and also feared God more than most people. And so the question is, why did Nehemiah choose to identify these two characteristics as someone who was being appointed to be the commander of the citadel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to see, like these were really two characteristics, and you know the ones that he used to, you know, appoint a commander. I think it shows that, you know, in life and even in this situation, that sure, like everyone's talents are important. Like everyone has been given a talent, and these things, like they're important to, you know, complete certain tasks. But actually, it's the character of a person that's going to push, you know, them through in the tough times, both for themselves, but then also for a nation as well. And you know, how often do we see, you know, promising nations, you know, kind of falter because, you know, the leader was maybe lying to the people or was being dishonest. So again, like the first characteristic, a man who had integrity, you know, he needed someone who was honest, who would, you know, stand up for what he believed in, stand up for what was right, and someone who would always you know, stand firm, not just to their beliefs, but even in this time they'll stand firm to the laws as well, because of course, like in this time in the Old Testament, the Torah was still, the Torah being the law, was still followed you know, by the Israelites. So I think also important that a man was integrous in this, and also a man that feared God, and that feared God more than most people. Again, this was important because you know, I think a man who wouldn't put himself above God in this task or in this position, but someone that would realize that actually that God, you know, is above them, that actually that this role that they were in, that, you know, they wouldn't glorify themselves over God, but then, you know, through, you know, this role, that they would glorify God in everything that they did. So I mean, that's I think what's really key about those two characteristics.
Highlights
that
this
Nehemiah
character, as you identified there. We're talking about the fear of God is an interesting phrase. The fear of God. You know, you think that it almost seems juxtaposed to the New Testament God that we read about, who, you know, it talks a lot about the love of God and the God who sent his own son for us. Dr. John, fear of God, what does that mean?
It's interesting here because you've got the integrity and the fearing of God. So the integrity very much applied to relationships with people, and the fearing God is very much the relationship with God. And I think when you think of fear, you think of fear and trembling and knocking at the knees. But that's not what certainly in the Hebrew and in the New Testament, where they use the word in the Greek words for fear, it's not meaning to be terrified of God, but to have a reverence and to have an awe, to realize how great God is. So it's not kind of a buddy type of thing, you know, it's a friend, but there's that respect and that awe. He's the creator of the whole universe. He's almighty, he's holy. And you read through the Bible and you see people, and they have a vision of God and they fall down, you know, God's holiness. So it's not being frightened. I think of the Apostle John saying that perfect love casts out fear. So what John is saying in the New Testament, that when we love God, we're not frightened of God, but we should have that awe and that reverence of how good and how powerful, how big God is. And that's, I think, what he's getting at here.
I think it's really helpful. It reminds me a little bit of, you know, I don't know if people have read or seen the films of the story of Narnia. You think of the character of Aslan, you know, he's kind of put forward as the character representing God in the story. And, you know, there's a line, isn't there, that talks about how Aslan, you know, he's very good, but he's not safe. There's a sense of, there's a sense of actually, there should be a healthy reverence, as you talk about there, Dr. John, and a sense of, I'm not going to take this for granted. I'm not going to take God's love and mercy and kindness for granted, but he's certainly good and he's loving and he's on our side. I think that's a really helpful picture, really. So that's Hananiah. And then right next to that, we've also got another name, which is, very similar, Hanani. Amy, what do we know about this person?
Yeah, so Hananiah we meet back in chapter 1, and he's known as Nehemiah's brother. And he's the one that ultimately brings the report that we first hear about of the state of Jerusalem when Jerusalem's walls were, they were in a rubble. And actually, Nehemiah saw, this guy, he's got a heart for Jerusalem. And actually then we see him be, appointed as co-leader with Hananiah. But I love that as well, because actually even before, these walls were rebuilt, he had a heart to see Jerusalem's wall built. And so we see him and Hananiah, come together and be those co-leaders of Jerusalem.
That's really helpful to know as well, isn't it? Because you kind of see, okay, he's Nehemiah's brother. Is he just appointing people who are close to him that he knows? It kind of conflicts with this thing of Hananiah, who's clearly looked at the character. But as you've identified, it's so much more than Nehemiah just choosing his own brother. He's, as you've shown, he's demonstrated a heart for the city of Jerusalem and a concern for God's priorities as well. So that's really helpful. And then following on from this, Nehemiah, he proceeds to give some almost oddly specific instructions about the opening and closing times of the gates. So, Dr. John, what is Nehemiah's concern here? Why is he giving such precise instructions when it comes to the gates?
The timing, really, the opening and closing of gates, it's crucial, really, for safety and security of the city. They have to be precise. It can't be a case of, open it when you want type of thing. And also, the people, the gatekeepers, would need to know their responsibilities and who was on at particular times. You couldn't have a situation where somebody would forget to close the gates or not close them properly. So it's really a security issue there, that they need to know when they're opening and closing. And also, of course, there will be trading. We'll see later on in the study, not supposed to be on the Sabbath.
Right.
That is raised up later on in the study. But there will be trading. There will be people coming in and out. And they need to know when the opening and closing times are. But I think really, it's a case of the security. So it's a pattern. So they're going to be closed well before it gets dark.
And that just continues on this theme of Nehemiah's chief concern really being for the security of what they've already built up. You don't want to throw away all that just by leaving the gate open. I think that's so helpful, isn't it? Because you can kind of read through the Bible and you see these things that appear almost a little bit odd. It might seem a little bit random almost, but it's by understanding that context of the story. This is like a narrative that we're understanding. It brings to life those details.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, isn't it, that it says until the sun is hot, which, at that time as well, that's suggesting, the heat of the day, which a lot of, that's kind of siesta time, isn't it? That's when a lot of people, take a nap.
Right.
And with most people resting, that could probably be the most vulnerable part of the day, couldn't it? And that could be, we've seen in previous chapters, that there's been opposition. So, the threat of an attack, that's a very possible one. So these watchmen, this is a really important role. So they had to be very vigilant. So this, this hottest part of the day, that could be a really high time for an attack. But actually, being vigilant and even, opening the gates late and closing early, that reduces the, the amount of time. So, it makes it a little bit more difficult for an attack. But it's a high time for security, high vigilance as well.
Really helpful to understand those. And then what does Nehemiah do next? Well, he highlights that there were a few people in the city where their houses, they hadn't actually been built yet. And so loudly, it's almost like when we realize that, we realize, so whilst the wall has been being rebuilt, some of these people haven't actually had a home to go to. How does that almost in retrospect help us understand the emphasis and importance that Nehemiah placed on rebuilding the wall?
Yeah, I think, Nehemiah, first of all, understood, as you said, these walls were important because what if, these houses had been built and just immediately, immediately destroyed afterwards, it's like, but actually he he stressed the importance, of the people, by building these walls. And then he then realized, oh, actually, this isn't just about the walls. It's also about the people. And I love how Nehemiah, he didn't just stop at the walls. Like, again, like the walls weren't just built, to, have like a nice surrounding area that, people could look at and take pictures of. Like, it wasn't the aesthetics of the wall. It was the point of the wall. And the point of the wall was the people. And immediately after he was done with the walls, we see an urgency from Nehemiah's part, after he appoints, his brother Hananiah, and he appoints Hananiah, that he's like, okay, like, where can I help out next? He's really, keen on actually the progress of his people. And I think, again, it's just really important to, to see this. And I think Nehemiah, like, he was a man who loved people. And I think that was really important here.
Isn't that great as well? Because I guess it shows the difference between like calling and career, because for Nehemiah, this wasn't just a project. This wasn't just a way to, kind of move up the ranks. Like, look, I rebuilt the walls. Actually, no, as you said, Laulu, he cared. He noticed that the population was low. He wanted to do something about that. Yeah. He noticed that there were many abandoned houses. He noticed that there were people without a home. He noticed because he cared. It was so much more than just a project or a career move for him.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because you think, what did Nehemiah do after he'd built a wall? Did he think, right, I'm going to go and build another wall somewhere else because what I do is build walls? No, he cared about the people and he looked at a new way to say. That's such a good point there. And then just moving through, anyone who's got a Bible open in front of them, watching or listening along, will notice that the rest of the chapter is really taken up with a genealogical record. So, Dr. John, the Bible is, full of these at different points, especially in the Old Testament, and there's different reasons for that. But why does Nehemiah give us the details of this record? And could you just tell us a little bit about it? Where's it from? What's its significance?
Yes. So basically, God put it into Nehemiah's heart to compile a census. Since the beginning of exile, many would have died, many would have been born. Some chose to remain in Babylon, so they needed an up-to-date record. He found genealogical records as well, so he wasn't starting from absolute scratch. There were records there. People returned to the hometown. The record listed the men of Israel, and there was a long list really of individuals. Priests, Levites, musicians, gatekeepers, servants, slaves, and even the animals. So why all this detail? And I think really all categories of people were included because they all belonged. They all had significance in the eyes of the leaders. And really more importantly, they had significance in God's eyes. And I think also, in the church where we're serving Jesus, everybody's significant. Everybody's loved by God. Everybody's important. Paul uses the analogy of the body. Every part of the body is essential. And so what he's saying there is we're making a note of all these people and noting who they are because we value them and we value what their role is. And they are important to God and important to the leadership as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to read, isn't it? Because you can read them and just see a list of names, but each name represents a story, and a story of somebody who, even though they were exiled, they then started to lay down their roots for so many years, but they had a pioneer spirit because they were willing to uproot, to come to Jerusalem, even though it was a mess, even though it was, rubble, but they had a pioneer spirit and they were willing to endure hardship and discomfort, ready to return to the place that God had promised, the promised land. And I think it's so incredible to think about those individual stories and those individual people as well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's important to even realize that it was only about 2% of the Jews who were, carried away into exile that actually came back. So I think it's so important when you mention that pioneering spirit, of these people, because actually they were so important. It was a minority, and I think it shows that even when doing the right thing is, I guess, the minority choice, it's still really good to have integrity and to stand up for what you believe in. So I just really agree with that, Amy. I think that's so important.
It's a really good point, isn't it? You think each of those people returning back, they knew that it wasn't gonna be a walk in the park, but actually God saw what they were doing, and you just think that that's so significant. And I think it's also interesting as we read the this record in particular. We see a familiar name in there, Zerubbabel. I think that just really adds to the authenticity of this book, because it just shows that that we know that the story of Nehemiah, it's so closely related to the story of Ezra in the book of the Bible, where we see Zerubbabel leading the first round of exiles back to Jerusalem. And so the fact that we see Zerubbabel in that list, it just shows it's another part of the historical record that shows that these stories really are entwined. Yeah, there's so much to learn from this book of Nehemiah. We really hope that you've learned something during this study of Nehemiah chapter 7. There's plenty to dig into, so I'd encourage you to go ahead and read the chapter through to yourself, and we'll see you next time where we'll be looking at Nehemiah chapter 8.